Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group. A little bit of information about the group. We meet every month. Meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover any and all topics related to .NET. And you can find meeting information, both past and present, as well as future meetings over on meetup.com with the link listed at the bottom of the slide. A big thank you to our sponsors, Tech Systems, Inedo, PostSharp, and DevExpress, and last but not least, NIS Technologies for sponsoring the web hosting. Some general information, please keep in mind that participation is encouraged. Even though we're meeting virtually, we try to make it as much of a roundtable discussion as much as possible. And the only stupid question is the one not asked. So feel free to jump in at any point in time with a question, either verbally or through the chat window. However, kindly ask you that if you're not speaking, to mute your microphones just to prevent any background noise. So we like to keep it as casual as possible, but at the same time organized enough to let the speaker get through the presentation and the demo. Also, the presentation will be recorded and posted on YouTube with a link made available in the chat window a little bit later. Tonight's featured presentation is Joe Kunk presenting on SQL+, the next generation SQL Server ORM. Joe is a senior software architect for Dewpoint Incorporated in Lansing, Michigan. He has over 25 years in IT, spanning a variety of different roles, from development to development manager, DBA, data warehouse architect, and network manager, and a variety of other roles that he's held over the years. He's also the organizer for GLUGnet, or the Great Lakes User Group.net, which meets every third Thursday. And he's a 5-time Microsoft MVP and has published over 30 articles. Overall, he's a great guy, great mentor, and a great speaker. So looking forward to his presentation tonight. And so with that, we'll turn it over to Joe. And let me make you presenter, Joe.
Okay. And I want to share this screen right here. All right, you should see my presentation with the little slides on the left here pretty quick.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. All right, so welcome everybody. I am very pleased to be here. I've known Sam for a long time. It's the first time I've had a chance, I think, to speak at the group, and very exciting opportunity. What I want to bring forward tonight is a ORM, and I'll go over, what that term is for those of you that may need a refresher. SQL+.net, and it's got a lot of very unique features, and because of the very unique features, I just want to kind of share and show how it's different. And because of the way it approaches things, it allows you to do it allows a lot more functionality than what I think a standard ORM can provide. So let me go ahead and just real briefly review. I'm using, when I use a term, I like to explain it. So what is an ORM? It stands for an object relational mapper, and it's a database mechanism it's a mechanism in code to get information in and out of a database and into the code in a way that is easier. We abstract away some of the complexities of the database and the interactions with the database. The standard comparison is ADO.NET, which is the original database code from Microsoft. And so if you've coded in ADO.NET, most of us probably have at one point or another. It uses connection objects, transaction objects, command objects, data readers, and it's all very loosely typed. It goes into data sets, and then you have to examine the data sets to see, what the columns are, and it's just not convenient. The one thing about ADO.NET, of course, though, is it's kind of the foundation. It's very fast, and I've been known to code in ADO.NET just to get that speed for not very complex applications. And so that just kind of, sets what an ORM is. It's to simplify database interactions, to put it in just a couple words. So what do we want in an ORM? We want to have the strongly typed database objects so we can, we get back a class that has the actual columns that represent the database table or the results of the query. We obviously want very good performance. We want to be able to minimize database interactions where possible. It's got to be easy to configure. We want it to be able to handle applications of all sizes and types. Obviously, it's got to support the .NET, the older, a little bit older .NET framework and the newer .NET Core. And let's see, we want to. So what's different about this one is it really lets us leverage our SQL skills. If you're comfortable writing SQL statements, queries, updates, deletes, potentially joins and other, other SQL language structures, this is really nice because it lets you fully leverage that. And then because it does enforce the parameterized query rule, so you don't have SQL injection issues. All your parameters will be parameterized. I won't go into great depth about SQL injection, but the main SQL injection is a very common attack. It's a very dangerous attack when it's exposed, and the main defense against SQL injection attacks is to use parameterized queries and never just concatenate strings together to do a query. So I think one more slide, then I'll go show you some stuff here. So really what it is it's what the company calls a SQL First ORM. And because that's very database friendly, and let me actually just drop this slides here. I know you didn't come to see slides, and let me show you a little bit of what I mean by this. Here's a SQL Plus stored procedure, and you can see in the comments here. Basically, it's a standard stored procedure. It can be in code. It doesn't have to be in the database. They do support what's called concrete queries, where you essentially have your stored procedure as a file in your project. And let me pull up his webpage. His webpage has got a really good example. The company's webpage has a really good example of that. Let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. Yeah. So what you've probably already kind of guessed is that unlike something like Dapper or Entity Framework, where the SQL commands are formulated at runtime or as part of the application, this is static. You would determine what SQL you want, and you would run a compiler. Basically, it's a VSIX addition into a package into the solution that reads all these annotations over here on the right and generates the code that you're going to need to interact with the database. So it's a compile time ORM as opposed to a runtime ORM. And for some situations, for the majority of situations, that's just fine. You pretty much know what you're going to need. If you are concerned about saying, well, I don't know every query I'm ever going to want, maybe I'm doing a report and I don't know what the users are going to ask for in terms of columns, you can do dynamic SQL, which is, basically formulate a SQL statement that has all the columns potentially and then based on parameters, it would dynamically execute the query that you need. You can do that. But if you look at this here, on the left is a standard stored procedure, and on the right is the SQL Plus version of it. And the difference is these annotation tags. So SQL Plus routine, the author is Alan Heineman. Now, Alan happens to be the owner of the company that creates this product. It is a commercial product, but it does have a free commercial edition tier, basically under the same license agreement, or similar to Visual Studio Community Edition. So, you can download a full-featured version of this and use it, play with it, experiment with it, and it would be at no cost. So, for professional developers, there is a small cost. I think it's $99 a year. But if you look at all the productivity you can get out of this, that's a pretty small cost. Anyway, off that aside, you can add comments. You can say this is going to be a non-query. It's it's an insert. It's a non-query because it needs to know how to build the code for this particular routine. So you got to give it some metadata, and then each of the parameters you can annotate with these comments, and you can say, hey, this parameter is required max like 32, whatever. And there's a lot of these different annotations, and I'll show you what the value of those have later. But in the end, what you have in this annotated SQL stored procedure is just plain SQL. Anything that changed on the right was just a comment, okay? And so it's when I said it's very DBA friendly, what I meant by that is that it's just SQL. So, I've had situations in the past where we've been working with Entity Framework, and Entity Framework generates the SQL based on your link queries within your code, and off the context. And it can sometimes generate some really wonky SQL, and that SQL can be very slow, can have issues, whatever. So, and the SQL that comes out of Entity Framework isn't particularly readable necessarily. So it's not DBA friendly to debug that query if there's issues. However, looking at SQL Plus, it's just standard SQL. So you could hand this stored procedure to a DBA and say, help me figure out why this isn't performant. And they would be very comfortable with that. So if you're in an environment where there's a little bit of tension between the DBAs and the developers, of course that never happens. This one would be a much easier interaction with your DBAs. So not to belabor that point, but this is really an ORM for people that are comfortable writing SQL. If you don't like writing SQL, if a create procedure statement makes your eyes cross, this is not the one for you. But it does have advantages, and that's what I wanted to bring forward in tonight's presentation. So let me drop this back down, and you can see here's I think it's a similar routine right here. So we've got all these different annotations, and then another thing you can see here on the bottom is you have code at the bottom of the stored procedure that says, hey, if I got a row count back of 0, then return not found, else return okay. So when you get back your strongly typed object with all your data, rather than having to figure out, well, do I have data in there or not, whatever, you get back an enumeration in your response object that tells you, hey, there was data not found, or it was okay. And you can have as many of these as you like, and they can be whatever you like. So if you had a complex stored procedure that maybe had, I've seen them where they've had, a dozen different major areas of what it's doing, maybe different CTEs and different things. Each one of those can have, an if statement after it that kind of explains to the returning application what's going on, what happened, why did it exit there instead of somewhere else, why didn't I get all the data, so you can build your own explanations of what happened in the query or in the procedure yourself, which I think is really nice. Entity Framework's not going to necessarily do that, or another common one, Dapper, is not necessarily going to do that. So this is informing you in a way that isn't otherwise available. And so I've got a couple other, it'll support MARS, multiple active result sets. So this particular query uses MARS. It's a standard SQL feature, and it says, hey, I'm going to bring back a multi-set, which means multiple records. It's an invoice data, and this stored procedure, what we have here on this one is we're going to start a query. I'm going to call it invoice, and it's going to return a single row. And there's my little query with my return value. And then I'm going to do some invoice lines, and then I'm going to do some additional query, call that tracking detail. So what you see here is it's just standard SQL with annotations. And I'll go into what the different annotations are. So if we look at what that looks like in code, I'll do customer by ID. Let's do that one. And what's that turn into in terms of code? So here's code, and I just did a cheesy little WinForms app because the GUI is not the point. So display by customer ID is where we call this particular routine. And you can see that the pattern is, one of the nice things about this ORM is the pattern for interacting with the database is very consistent, okay? Because the work is really being done in the store procedure, or what they call the concrete query, the local query, all you're doing is calling it and getting the, you're creating the input object, strongly typed input object for that particular routine. You're validating it. If it's valid, then you're going to call the service and get the code. If it comes back, you're going to check the result, return values to see what happened, and then you've got your data. And so virtually every single call is a variation of this. And obviously, if you don't have input parameters, you wouldn't have an input object, but it's a very consistent interaction, and that makes it very productive to write these methods. So let's take a look a little bit more about how some of this works. And I'm just trying to show the features where it adds beyond a standard ORM. So the input is customer by ID, and you can, let me zoom in here. You can see it faded out, but customer ID for customer table. See that comment on the input object? That comment actually came from the stored procedure. So if you look here at the stored procedure that's annotated, let's see here, I'll pull a little bit wider. Right there it is, customer ID for customer table. So you put in the stored procedure a comment about that particular parameter, and the generator or compiler brought that into the application as the comment for the input object and the input parameter. So that's kind of cool, right? It's actually helping you document your application. And then you just say, hey, if input is valid is a standard method on every single input object that's generated, and it checks all these validations for you. So if you've got a stored procedure, with 20 parameters, and it has numerous annotated validations, it checks those for you based on the data that you put in that input object. It'll say, is the data in range? Is a required field there? Is it a postal code column that is a parameter that you said is a postal code? Does it matter? Or does it match a postal code format? And there's numerous of those, and I'll go jump over to the presentation. I've got them listed on one of my slides here. So here they are. So obviously you can add a comment. You can say, hey, this particular parameter is a credit card format. It doesn't process the credit card. It just makes sure it meets the credit card numeric rules. You can provide a default value for a parameter. This one, display name, comma, description. This is for things like WPF and MVC, where you're binding to the GUI. And in your database, you can tell that column what name and what description you want on that MVC, and it'll generate that into the MVC. You can consume that in the MVC class. You can also use resources, so it'll actually implement the translation to the resource file for foreign languages. You can say email format, HTML format, minimum, maximum lengths on a string. Input is actually a little bit of a misnomer. It says that parameter is going to actually be an input/output parameter as opposed to just input. But this is how you can implement an output parameter and have that output appear in the response object, response class. URL format, password format. Now, what this does, the password format doesn't check to make sure it's a good password. It doesn't say, so many letters and numbers and characters. What it'll do is when you bind this to a UI object, if it's coded password in the database, then it'll do the dibbles for the display as opposed to showing the contents of the field. So it does that much for you. Phone format, postal, arrange, enumeration. Now I'll show you a demo or an example of enumeration in a little bit. But basically what this is you can identify a query as an enumeration, and it will read a table in the database and generate that enumeration from the data into your application and that you can use. So it's a way to kind of move some of that enumeration or functionality or list functionality into the code from the database, or make it more maintainable perhaps in the database. I'll go back here. You can have a maximum, just a maximum length. You can required, of course, minimum length only. And then if all else is, if that doesn't meet any of your needs, you have the ability to implement a regex over that parameter. So you can define a .NET regex expression, regular expression, regex expression, and it will validate that regular expression and then not allow you to call the database unless that's satisfied. So I want to emphasize that too a little bit, is that because we're saying if the input is valid and we're doing this validation based on what was read off the database at the code generate time, if it fails any of these validations, we haven't even called the database yet. So now here, this is an opportunity where we get additional performance, right? Rather than going to the database and having the database tell us that something's not right, we know it's not right and we can address it before we ever even go to the database. So what's the best way to have good database performance? Don't call it with bad data, right? But assuming the data is correct, we would create an instance of the generic service from the connection string. And then we would create our output model, which is customer ID output. That's always the naming convention. It's the name of the method or the database method we're calling output. And then that's from the service that's generated. And we provide, well, we're actually calling it right here. The output is the output of calling the service based on the input. And then I just threw up on the screen that we actually didn't manage to call the database in that instance. And then here we're checking that annotation at the end of the store procedure with our result of what happened right here in code. If the output return value is equivalent to returns okay, based on that particular object from the database, returns okay was one of the, we saw it down here, returns okay, then we go ahead and process and use the data. Else, if it's not, we say, hey, if it was not found, then I can show a message or handle the error however I want that it was not found. Otherwise, I throw a general, exception. But we're getting a lot out of this ORM, right? It's not just calling the database and giving us data. It's helping us have, well-structured, intelligent, readable code. Let's see. So this, yep. And another thing I want to point out here too is this parameter in the store procedure has a default of 5. That default of 5, as specified as part of the store procedure parameter, is never used in the generated code. This is just here to help you, so that SQL Plus ignores this default so that you can set up defaults on all your store procedure parameters and have a standard, test that you can run without having to type in all the parameters every time to help test and debug and validate your store procedures. So it's smart enough to know to leave that alone and let you use that for your debugging and support needs. And I think I have, yep. input validation results. So if the input is not valid, right, before we even call it, what we can do is the ORM in the generated services actually will create the error message based on what the error was. So we can see that when I run my little demo. Now I know when you present virtually, you don't hear anything. I'm taking a checkpoint. Is everybody following me? Does this make sense? Is there anything I need to re-explain or go over?
I'm with you, and so far I don't see any questions in chat, so you're good.
Okay, great. So like I said, this presentation might not be really long because I just kind of want to go over this concepts, but see, this is very different than obviously Entity Framework or Dapper or something that is consumed at runtime. So this build SQL plus error message, let's take a look at that. So here, if I pass it a validation results, it'll walk through the collection of validation results, right? Because if you've got a large stored procedure, you could have multiple validations that fail. So we have a collection, and we're going to walk through that collection, and we can build an error message based on the errors messages generated from those collections. Keep in mind, the error messages are generated by SQL Plus, not by you. So, going back to this slide here, think of all the code you might have to write if you wanted to have these validations in your database interactions. You don't have to write any of this code. It's all you have to do is annotate the parameter on the stored procedure, and the validation is there. And then, what if you don't like the validation? What if you want it to operate slightly differently? In the code, each of these validations is a partial class, and it's extensible. So you can place the partial class in an area that's not regenerated. And so you can have your own extensions onto these validations. So you're not limited to how they do it. You can modify it. So again, we're saving a lot of coding. As I said in the introduction to the presentation, what if your ORM can help you be a better developer and save you time? This is how it saves you time. It handles all these validations for you. Okay. So let me go ahead and just run a little bit. Again, it's a really cheesy demo. I just wanted to show a little bit here. All right, just a simple little WinForms app that I put together because I want to talk about the database. Customer by ID. If we look at the code for customer ID, range 1 through 10. Okay, so here if I call with a 3 for an ID, it just gives me a row out of the database, no problem. And the database was called. I have a note. Let me zoom in here real quick, show you. I have a note that says, hey, the database was called, and I just get a row out of the Chinook database. No big deal. But if I call it with 11, which is outside that range, and I'm going to zoom in here and show you what happened. Okay, we never actually even called the database, and there's the error message. The field customer ID must be between 1 and 10, : customer ID. That was generated in that routine I showed you, and based on the error that was returned from those validation methods, right, that were generated for you. I didn't write that error message, okay? Again, saving you time in coding. So it's like a super ORM. And then we saw the Mars application. We returned 3 different result sets. I just go ahead and call that. And there's the 3, basically 3 table objects that were returned from that one SQL call. So it does support Mars. It also supports JSON. Let me see here. Rerun this real quick. It also supports JSON as a result set. So control 1, and that's, SQL Server can output JSON, and so can this. This supports all of the different more complex data types in SQL Server. It'll support geometry and geography and some of the ones that are a little bit less used but can be complex. So to my knowledge, there aren't any data types in SQL Server that it can't handle. You may be wondering, does it support databases other than SQL Server? And the answer at this point, unfortunately, is no. It is a SQL Server only ORM. But there's the JSON coming back. And then, I showed you the example of the return values. And I'll pull up that little code here. This is just an example of where I threw some annotations into a very, basically a stored procedure that didn't do anything. But if the parameter, let's see, pull a little bit wider here. So the parameter is employee ID, and then, no, that's not the one I want. I want this one. Come on, show me this one. It's over here. I'll pull it over here. Okay, now I got my footing back on. So this returns a single row, and it just does a simple select star from customer ID. But I just wanted to illustrate that you can have as many of these return objects as you want. And so throughout a very complex procedure, you can, if you're exiting at any particular point before the end, you can give a very informative message as to why. And I can, just quickly show that in the demo here. If it's a 1, we get this message, which is over here. It's coming straight from the based on this return to updated, no address, whatever. I just made up reasons. So just to show that you can have as many as you want. And see, that's one of the things, but this is really kind of, in a sense, it's so simple. There isn't a whole lot to show. Let me go into the code side of it a little bit, because all of you people who live in code all day are probably gasping for breath. You haven't seen enough code yet. So here's how it works. I will quickly do a generate and then show you. So SQL Plus, this is where the code is generated. SQL Plus, these are all the different classes that were generated off the database that I am pointing to and that it has methods for. So again, here's the output method, output class for that particular one. Let's see, update output. Yeah, update output doesn't have much. Anyway, but there's all the generated code. You generally, unless you want to extend it, you don't really ever need to go into there. I can actually take this whole routine or this whole folder and just delete it. And crossing my fingers, I'm deleting the right one, but I am. And then I right-click on this, and I've installed the extensions, VSIX extensions. So there's the SQLplus.net build. And it does have a username and login that you have to provide. Again, for the community edition, it just logs in and validates that you're registered, but it's free. And I just hit build project. And it's misbehaving. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. So it's just, based on what I showed you so far, it's just that easy. You create your stored procedures, you annotate them, and then you run the generate, and it builds all the services and input and output classes for you. So how do we set it up? Let's look at that for a minute. So we have a let's see, database connection JSON right here. We have a very simple JSON, or just very simple JSON object, which just has database name connection string. that you would use to connect to your database. Now, that could have a password. So what you would do is in your Git, you would do a git exclude of this particular file right here so that you wouldn't, let me zoom in case you're not seeing it well. There, you would just have a git exclude of that database connection.json object. You wouldn't put that in Git because that could potentially have a password. And so that's a security feature. They make it convenient to keep that a secret. Then if we go look at the build definition file, JSON, and all these comments come with it when you run it the first time, so it kind of guides you. But here's what we're saying. Here's how we configure it when we first set up. We're saying that we're using the full .NET framework, and that's the framework. That's what we want to build in. It does support .NET Core, so you can have it build in Core as opposed to framework. And then we have any number of build schemas where we're saying, hey, go look for things in the DBO schema in the database, and when you generate that as a service in the code, put it under the DBO namespace of the code, or the DBA area of the code, right there, DBO. And we can, in SQL Plus, under SQL Plus, you could say, I want schemas DBO and SQL Plus both to go into the DBO namespace. You can join that namespace through this compile process. So even though they're separate schemas in the database, they can be in the same namespace in the application. That's your choice, okay? And then we also can specify enumeration queries, and so we're saying, hey, I want an enum built into the code from the genre table. I want to call it genre. I want it from the genre table. I'm using the name column of the table as the name of the enumeration, and the value comes from the genre ID column. And I only want rows where it's active. Active equals 1. And so what that would generate then into my application is this particular enumeration. So, I leave it to you to decide where that's useful, but if potentially you could have an application where it's just convenient to maintain that in the database rather than manually maintaining it yourself. Probably more useful is the next thing I want to show you, and that is static data. So down here in the bottom, I want a static query. So customer countries, right? The countries in which I have customers generally won't change that much, that often. So in that case, I'm going to select all my distinct countries and put them in, from the customer, and put that into a static query called customer countries. And so, or static data object. So let me pull that up here, right here. So this is generated from that configuration object. And it went and ran the query at compile time, and it built this, list of customer countries. So again, another performance feature. If I've got something that changes very rarely, I can create a collection of that information into the application, and it's coded into the application. So I don't have to go to the database to get this. So it's another opportunity to move more of the data into the application at compile time so that you don't have to make round trips to the database. Another performance feature. So, and I'm looking to see what else I haven't covered. I haven't covered concrete queries. Maybe you don't want to, update the database with a store procedure every time you have a change. A lot of times what I will do is I will prototype the queries as concrete queries in my code. And then once I feel comfortable that these queries are doing everything I want and they're wonderful, I will go move them over into the database of store procedures at that point. So it's a way for me to kind of prototype some of this. It's not as sophisticated as the database store procedures, but it works. And so this is just the concrete query. So it's just a multi-row. Again, I just go get a bunch of rows. It's just got a single query in it. And this compiles into the application and into the services just like a store procedure, but it's actually located in my project. So that's that. And I think in terms of code, that's about it. There's one other thing that it can do, and I haven't coded it yet, but it's not in the demo, but it supports transient errors. And basically what I mean by that is if you're in a mobile application, right, you're potentially going to have spotty internet connections, and you may make a query out to the database, and it may not connect, for whatever reason, right? These services that are generated, and I see if I've not done this myself yet, so let me see if I can see. Let me see if I can find it in the services. So album update is here. Yeah, let's see here. This is the generated service. And it generates just standard ADO.NET, code, but you didn't have to write it. I'm not finding it. There's your parameters, setting the direction, it's doing all the databasey stuff for you. But you can implement an interface in these services, and in that interface, you get to specify which SQL connection errors are you concerned about, how many retries do you want before you're actually going to fail, and what's the time interval between each retry. So I can say I expect errors, X, Y, and Z, and I want to retry 5 times, and I want 2 seconds between each retry. And it'll implement the code through the interface. It'll provide the services to check all that, and it'll only fail once it goes beyond those limitations, those specifications. So he's got a video, or the company's got a video on their website that actually shows it really well. It shows how to code it, and it shows actually, turning off SQL Server, getting some errors, turning SQL Server back on, and then it completes the connection. So if that's something you're concerned about, it does that. It has that available through a relatively easy interface to code. And again, would Entity Framework necessarily provide you that, or Dapper provide you that? And I would say no. So, if you could be comfortable with the compile time aspect of this, it can give you a lot of functionality. And I'm going to stop and ask, are there any questions at this point?
I got a question for you, Joe.
Yes.
And I'll forewarn everyone, hold on to your drinks. How well does this handle bad database design, i.e. if I have tables that don't have primary keys, if I inherited a bad database, how well can this fit in and help me maneuver through it?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm sorry that happened to you. So what it does is it's SQL queries, right? SQL queries, store procedures, whatever. So it will do what you tell it to do. If you've got a database with a table with no primary keys and it's just a big heap table, there's nothing in this application that's going to add a key into the table for you, right? This is a read-only extension. It never changes the database in any way. Okay, and I should have mentioned that at the beginning. So that's why it's safe, right? It's safe because it will never change anything. I believe the permission it needs to do what it needs to do is the view schema permission in SQL Server, and that's obviously a read-only type permission of the database objects. It only cares about the objects. well, and then it needs the connection string you provide needs to have any kind of permissions that the actual database operations require. Could you write a store procedure that brings in a heap table and adds, and puts an index on it and, and makes it better? You could for that routine. So, it's a little bit of garbage in, garbage out. It's up to you. It's just a matter of how intelligent you want to write the SQL, right?
Gotcha. So
I'm afraid I don't have a better answer than that.
No, it's understandable. So you mentioned that it's read only. So does that mean if I need to modify the schema, I need to go outside of this product and modify it?
This product is not like Entity Framework where you would do a migration into the database with new objects. It will just read what is there. So your database maintenance in terms of adding tables, updating column type, changing data types on columns, things like that, is all done through the traditional SSMS tool.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. So it doesn't. That's one of the nice things about it though is it doesn't really introduce anything new. It just leverages what's already there beyond the annotations. If we go into SSMS, I think I've got it up here in case I wanted to pull it up and show you some. Let's see. Yeah. Here's SSMS. If I'm building here, here's a, well, let me open one of these up. I don't think it's got very many columns, but that one's okay. So if I'm building this, okay, I don't have it memorized what all these tags are, right? And it would be kind of cumbersome if I had to remember them all. So it does come with a snippets file that you can insert. So I do Control-K-X, there's my snippets, here's SQLplus.net, and then here's all those annotations, including this big one at the top, which is the routine. Here's the routine for a JSON, for multiple rows, for a multi-set, which is Mars. A routine that doesn't return anything, single row, or XML. So, you have these snippets that are provided so you don't have to remember all the syntax, okay? And then the other thing is, if you're doing an application with this, and you're manipulating a lot or working with a lot of different tables, you want to have standard CRUD, create, read, update, delete routines for each of the tables. And going through and doing this for each of the tables and annotating all the columns would be potentially a lot of work. Certainly more than I would want to do in anything beyond a trivial database. So they do have, the company does provide this generate CRUD. So if you have, you're using this kind of tool and you want to have, you'll need the ability to do your standard, CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. Create, read, update, and delete. And you won't want to hand code them because you have all these annotations and all the columns. So for any database that's more than a trivial size, you wouldn't want to do it by hand. So what they do is they provide you with a stored procedure that you can run that generates all this for you. And it will generate two different read procedures. It'll generate one that's reading by the primary key, by ID, and then another one that'll read based on any data you give it. So if you give it a couple columns, it'll go find the row or rows that have that data. And beyond that, you can code your own. So the parameters that it asks for to generate the CRUD procedures are, what's the schema that it's in now? What's the table name? What schema do you want it to be coded for in terms, of where it'll run? Sometimes you have your tables in one schema, but you want your store procedures in another schema. So what destination schema do you want to be in? And then the author name of who wrote these routines, which would be the person running this generally. And do I still have? No. So what it'll do, I lost the call I had set up. But basically, it'll run through and generate all this as text into your results, and then you just copy that into a SQL window and run it, and it generates all the stored procedures for you. So it becomes like a print output of the stored procedure, and but it's everything you need to generate those for that table. I could probably do one really, really quick just to show you. Let's do customer. So let me copy this, and this Z generate CRUD procedures is probably not the name that it comes with. I've been playing around with it and trying to enhance it, so I'm sure I renamed it source destination. So exec that routine, and it's a DBO table, and it's called customer, and I want it to generate to the SQL Plus schema, and Joe Kunk did this. And you can see there's nothing here, but if I go over to messages and pull that up, you'll see here's all the code, stored procedure code to generate the CRUD for that particular table. It's all here. And then I would copy that, move it over to a new window, paste it in, and I would take out at the bottom the completion time message. And it probably won't work because it's probably already there for that one, but I would run, and if I hadn't already created them, it would just create those CRUD routines or those CRUD store procedures for me. So that's one of the helpers that they give you to make this easier. I'm not sure if in the previously I showed you, but I think I did. There's this, the snippets that you have available. And going back, so let me just kind of wrap up here. Just go over some things here. So how does this compare? This is not mutually exclusive with Entity Framework or any other ORM you're using. You can use it alongside. I said some of these are vendor claims, but I agree with most of these. The productivity is similar to Entity Framework. Performance is often better because of the wonky queries you can get sometimes from Entity Framework. It claims to be up to 4 times faster than Entity Framework, faster than Dapper, easier to use than Dapper because it's a very simple syntax, SQL syntax, if you're comfortable with that. Again, it can be used, I showed you the consistent coding pattern. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Link to SQL from .NET 3.5, although that was just a compile of the metadata and you still did your link queries, but it still kind of reminds me of that a little bit. How does it work? You install the extension, you configure your SQL Plus JSON file, you write your metadata, you generate the classes and objects off the metadata with the V6 that you saw, and you go ahead and enjoy some really nice functionality in concrete data classes. What can it output? Non-query, single row, multi-row, JSON, multi-set, which is the Mars you saw, and it can generate XML as well. So pretty flexible set of outputs. Those are all the annotations that you can put on to the parameters I showed you. It does support database transactions with rollback. So if you have stored procedures that are updating multiple tables like an invoice detail, and you want a transaction, that's not a problem. It supports that, no problem. We talked about transient errors. It supports that. It's the iTransient logger with 2 Gs interface. It supports the advanced types. They're partial classes and extensible. It has tags for display binding in things like MVC or WPF. You can combine database schemas. And so he does have a GitHub repo. There's a link to that on the final slide. So you can, if you're interested, you can pull down some of those applications in the GitHub repo and try it out and run them. The tag in SQL Stack Overflow is SQL-plus-.net. So stored procedures have advantages in the database itself. They're pre-parsed and are optimized to some degree. Helps because of the equals on the parameters. You can use it in unit testing. Let's see. Some of the things that have been mentioned by the company that they're looking at for the future versions, they want to have a configuration GUI so you don't have to manually type in those configuration values, and where potentially you would even generate all your CRUD operations through a GUI interface that would let you specify schemas, tables, and down to even individual columns, so you want to have included in your CRUD operations. They're looking at asynchronous ADO.NET as opposed to, right now it's all synchronous. I actually had an email discussion with the company about that, and they claim that the synchronous ADO.NET works just as well as asynchronous. There's not a lot of benefit to the asynchronous. I don't know how you feel about that, but their response was in all their testing, they really haven't seen much benefit from an asynchronous ADO.NET set of routines versus synchronous. That was the response. And we saw that we can generate the CRUD helper menus. In terms of licensing, Community Edition is free. It's all the features. It's not cut back in any way. It's available to individual developers, classroom learning, academic research, open source projects, and any organization doing less than $1 million a year in annual revenue. So say I'm your side business, you're good until you get to $1 million.
Good to know.
Yeah, it could be any day now, right? Professional edition is $99 a year to use it in a company that doesn't meet these conditions. Pretty inexpensive. Enterprise edition is for 10 users. It's a little higher price, is $1,500, but that includes some training and a lot more support options. If you're a community edition user or any of these users, you can install this on any number of computers that you want, but you can only use it on one at a time, right? And so the main website for this is sqlplus.net, and there's the GitHub repository, AAH software, SQL Plus sample app. So with that is what I have to show you. Any final questions?
I had a question. The model rebuild, is that an all or nothing? Does it rebuild everything in there, or can you have it rebuild parts?
It is an all or nothing at this point.
Okay.
It will rebuild everything. The complexity of trying to figure out what changed and what didn't, by the time you go through and try to figure out what changed and what didn't, it's probably faster just to regenerate it.
I know when I've had problems with Entity Framework and working with teams of developers where large projects, and you have that in there, and invariably you go do a rebuild and it breaks somebody else's code, something like that, and something that wasn't intended.
How I'm trying to think, how would that happen? Because this is all driven.
Database or something of that nature,
Yeah, if someone had made a change in the database, had made a change in the database and they hadn't properly tested it, maybe. Yeah. But again, now think about this. You can have alternate schemas, right? As many schemas as you want. So each developer could be working in their own schema, and it's all combined together in the application. So it's transparent to the, basically to the developer which schema it came from, right? So you can isolate each of the developers into their own area of the database to help minimize some of that problem.
Yeah, that was always a big problem with the Entity Framework, though, because it would be an all or nothing like that. And that was why I kind of gravitated to Dapper.
Okay. So you do use Dapper most of the time. Okay.
So.
Let me turn my camera back on so I can give a proper face to my wrap up. Let's see here. Okay, see me again?
Yep. Audio
so
and
this
video.
is all right. I apologize for the technical error. I'm living a little dangerously today. I actually switched from one internet provider to another one this morning. So I don't know if that was part of the reason. I like to live on the edge, right, Sam?
Absolutely.
So today's the day that they're shutting off the old one and turning on the new one. The new one's been on for a little while, and I switched everything last night, so I had my fingers crossed that it would be transparent, but perhaps not.
It happens. We survived it.
Okay, thank you. So that's what I have. I think it's, the whole point is it's a chance to, look at the database in ORM environment from a whole different perspective. It's the only one that I'm aware of that does take that perspective. You can obviously see that the company put a lot of work into making this a very good product and providing you features and functionality well beyond just talking to the database, right? It can eliminate a lot of coding you would otherwise have to do. So I think it's worth being aware of, and I encourage all of you to go check it out.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Joe.
Anything else?
Any other questions or comments for Joe?
Before we sign off?
All right, we'll just have a few closing announcements, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time and sharing this with us, Joe. Highly appreciated. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take back the presentation mode just to cover some closing slides. All right, so if you take a look over at the chat window, you'll see that there's a couple links. One for the YouTube channel where the presentation will be posted. Another for my blog where all the technical events that I'll go through are going to be posted. And then last but not least is the feedback evaluation. So again, I invite you to check those out. So the YouTube link, basically once the presentation is edited, it will be uploaded there. Kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel so you get upload notifications. As far as the technical events, they'll be posted on my blog, samnasser.blogspot.com. And lastly, the feedback eval is also posted in the chat window as well. So as far as events that are coming up, virtual user group meetings on August 27th, which is tomorrow, is the Cleveland OWASP group, and they're going to be meeting online. On September 7th is the Ohio North Database Training Group, and they're going to be meeting actually in a park. So it's going to be a little bit more convenient and a little bit more enticing versus a lot of the online meetings we've been attending. And that's going to be happening on September 7th. Meeting information can be found on their meetup sites with the link available there. On September 15th is the Hudson Codecraft Group, and that's going to be meeting also online. September 16th, GLUGnet, or the Great Lakes Users Group. That's the group that Joe has been heading for several years. And they're going to be meeting on the third Thursday of every month. And in September, that will be September 16th. And then followed up by the fourth Thursday of every month is this group's September meeting. And although we haven't secured a speaker yet, one will be secured and the meeting will go on. With regards to virtual conferences, September 15th through the 17th is Music City Tech, and that's going to be happening online. And if you check out their website, musiccitytech.com, and let me share that with you. Basically, this is a 3-day virtual event, September 15th through the 17th, and it has 3 simultaneous conferences that are happening. Tickets are $200 for each conference. You have Music City Code, Music City Agile, and then Music City Data. And the URL for that is musiccitytech.com. And continuing on with the virtual conferences, Azure Community Conference, that is October 29th through the 31st. That is happening live from India. And they'll be broadcasting in English and a variety of other languages as well, but mostly English. And the link for that is azconf.dev. On November 8th through the 12th is the Past Data Community Summit. So typically, if you're working in .NET, you're going to be utilizing SQL Server. And if you're utilizing SQL Server, it's always good to participate in the past conference and find out the latest and greatest that's happening in the SQL Server community. As far as job openings, typically I always like to ask if there's anyone from Tech Systems that's available. I know they always have some jobs posted at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. But in addition, who is hiring in the group? Feel free to raise hands or speak up. Okay, got a shy bunch tonight. And if you're looking for work, again, please make yourself known. You can also speak up or enter it into chat, or feel free to email me and I can connect you with anyone who might be looking. Anyone who's hiring rather. And so in closing, my contact information if needed, snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can always find me on Twitter @SamNasser, and then the link to my blog. And lastly, I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. So if there's no questions or comments, I thank you all for attending and look forward to seeing you in our September meeting.
Hey, Sam. Thanks, Joe.
Yep, thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.